When Chad's fighter jets suddenly scrambled toward Burkina Faso's northern border, international observers watched what looked like the beginning of a regional conflict. What they didn't know was that this moment, this shocking military escalation, wasn't born from any genuine dispute between two neighboring nations. It was theater. Calculated, desperate theater orchestrated by powers whose grip on Africa was slipping for the first time in centuries. This is the story of how a young African leader named Ibrahim Traoré saw through the operation before it even happened, turned the tables on France and its proxies, and in doing so, exposed something the Western world had worked decades to hide, that the age of unquestioned dominance over the African continent was officially over. To understand why Chad's military was being pushed toward Burkina Faso, you first need to understand the invisible war happening across the Sahel. It's not a war you'll see on CNN. It doesn't have clear battle lines or uniformed armies clashing in open fields. Instead, it's a war fought through pressure, influence, and control, with African nations caught in the middle. France has maintained a presence in West Africa for over a century, not through occupation anymore, but through what we might call the architecture of dependency: military bases, defense agreements, economic leverage. The assumption, unspoken but deeply embedded in every interaction, that Africa belonged to France, that African leaders would do what France asked because they had no real choice. Burkina Faso shattered that assumption. In 2022, Ibrahim Traoré, then a young military captain, helped lead a coup that removed the previous government. What made Traoré different from every other military leader France had worked with before was simple but revolutionary. He didn't just tolerate Russian involvement in his country, he actively welcomed it. Russia's Wagner Group, Russian military advisors, Russian equipment. These became visible symbols of an alternative path, a way for Burkina Faso to escape the suffocating grip of French control. For France, this was not just a political problem. It was an existential threat. Russian influence, spreading across the Sahel, meant losing control over vast territories rich in natural resources, losing military bases, losing the ability to shape African politics from the shadows. France had faced regional setbacks before, but never something like this. A leader who seemed genuinely unwilling to bow to French pressure. This brings us to Chad. Unlike Burkina Faso's defiant young military leader, Chad's government had maintained a more traditional relationship with France. Still dependent on French military support. Still accustomed to taking orders. Still locked into the old system of control that had characterized Franco-African relations for generations. But Chad was also strategically positioned. It sits directly north of Burkina Faso. It has a military with combat capabilities. It was, in essence, the tool France needed to send a message. According to what would later become clear through intelligence monitoring and regional analysis, France applied intense, calculated pressure on Chad's leadership. The message was direct: Burkina Faso's ties to Russia, its growing independence, its refusal to play by the old rules. These were destabilizing the entire region. France needed Chad to act, to launch strikes against Burkina Faso's supply lines, to disrupt the Russian presence, to remind Traoré that sovereignty in Africa was still ultimately determined by Western permission. And here's where things get interesting. Chad complied. Fighter jets were prepared. Operations were planned. For the first time in months, it looked like the pressure campaign might actually work, that France could use a neighboring state to force Burkina Faso back into line. It was the kind of move that had worked countless times before, the kind of geopolitical leverage that had kept Africa divided and dependent for so long. But there was one problem. Ibrahim Traoré had already seen it coming. This is perhaps the most underestimated part of the entire story. Traoré wasn't some naive young leader stumbling through his first months in power. He was running a government in one of the most geopolitically contested regions on Earth. That meant his intelligence apparatus was working overtime, monitoring threats from every direction, from France, from neighboring states, from the various militant groups operating across the Sahel. When Chad began mobilizing its military, when the pressure from France started intensifying, Traoré's intelligence services picked it up. They were watching. They understood what was happening, not in some vague sense, but operationally. They knew about the jets. They knew about the planned strikes against supply routes. They knew the timing. They knew the targets. What Traore did with this information was crucial. He didn't immediately escalate. He didn't call for public condemnation or declare war on Chad. He didn't give France the conflict it was hoping for, the kind of regional instability that would justify increased Western military intervention and humanitarian concerns that would inevitably swing back toward French control. Instead, he did something far more sophisticated. He prepared quiet defenses. He rerouted critical supply lines. He moved Russian equipment and advisors to locations that wouldn't be vulnerable to a sudden strike. He essentially dismantled the operational logic of the entire French plan before the jets ever left the ground. But that was just the defensive play. What happened next showed why Traore was proving to be such a different kind of African leader. When you're facing a military operation orchestrated by a former colonial power, most leaders have three options: fight back militarily, back down completely, or appeal to international bodies that are essentially controlled by those same powers anyway. Traore chose a fourth option. He picked up the phone and called Chad's president directly. This moment, this simple act of direct communication, represents something genuinely unprecedented in modern Franco-African relations. Traore wasn't appealing to an international court. He wasn't filing complaints with distant organizations. He was going directly to the African leader being used against him and confronting him with a simple, devastating truth. You're being manipulated. France is using you. This entire operation is designed to keep African nations weak and divided. The conversation that followed stripped away all the strategic pretense. Traore laid out exactly what was happening, how external powers, specifically France, were using African nations as proxies in a larger geopolitical game. He showed Chad's leader the manipulation, the pressure campaign, the way independence was being punished and compliance rewarded. He made the case not from a position of anger or desperation, but from clarity, from an understanding that both Chad and Burkina Faso shared a common interest that transcended any single military operation: African sovereignty itself. Here's what happened next that truly changed the equation. Chad's jets still launched, but when they reached Burkina Faso's airspace, something unexpected happened. The defenses that Traore had quietly prepared were active and alert. The supply routes that had been rerouted were empty of the valuable targets the operation was designed to hit. The element of surprise, the entire operational foundation of the French plan, had evaporated. Faced with actual air defenses and empty targets, facing the reality that the operation had somehow been anticipated and neutralized, Chad's jets turned around. They returned to their bases without accomplishing a single objective. The mission failed not because of a massive firefight or an international incident, but because it was already dead before it began. This is the moment where we have to pause and ask ourselves, what just happened here? On the surface, it looks like a failed military operation, a miscalculation, an intelligence failure that led to an aborted mission. And technically, that's all accurate. But beneath that surface is something far more significant, a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Sahel. For the first time in the modern era, a young African leader had anticipated a Western orchestrated operation, prepared defenses without tipping his hand, and then confronted the manipulator directly. Not through military might, not through international institutions, but through clarity, through forcing his counterpart to see the game being played. The operation's failure wasn't just about Chad's jets turning around. It was about the revelation of the mechanism itself. Once Traore showed Chad's leader what was happening, once the invisible hand of French control was made visible, the entire operation became impossible to continue. You can't maintain a proxy relationship when both parties understand they're being used against each other. And the implications rippled outward. What had just been exposed wasn't just this one operation. It was the entire system. The way France had maintained control in Africa, the way pressure was applied, how independence was punished, how compliance was rewarded. Traore had shown that this system could be disrupted, not through rejection of it, but through understanding it. But that's not quite the full story. There's something else happening in this moment that's crucial to understand. Everyone watching this situation was focused on the surface conflict. France versus Burkina Faso. Colonial power trying to maintain control versus a new leader trying to break free. But there was another player in this game, one that was becoming increasingly important to the regional dynamic. Russia's presence in Burkina Faso wasn't accidental or incidental. The Wagner Group, Russian military advisors, Russian equipment. These represented something that previous African leaders simply didn't have access to. A genuine alternative to Western military and political support. For the first time, African nations could choose not just between different Western powers, but between the West entirely and a completely different geopolitical orientation. This terrified France more than anything else, because it meant that the old system of leverage no longer worked automatically. You couldn't simply cut off military aid and expect compliance, because there was now a backup option. You couldn't pressure neighboring countries by threatening to withdraw support, because Russian support was becoming available as an alternative. France's desperation in pushing Chad toward military action wasn't really about some abstract threat that Burkina Faso and Russia posed. It was about the fact that the system that had allowed France to dictate African politics for generations was breaking down in real time. And once that system started to crack, the entire structure of Western dominance in Africa became vulnerable. What Traore understood, and what France was beginning to realize, was that this moment, right here, was the pivot point. Either France found a way to reassert control immediately, or the entire region would start tilting away from French influence. Every African leader watching Traore successfully stand up to France, and its proxies would be thinking the same thing. Maybe there actually is another path. Maybe sovereignty is possible. Maybe we don't have to accept this anymore. Here's where the narrative gets genuinely complex. Traore's success in neutralizing the Chad operation, his successful confrontation with French pressure, his embrace of Russian support, all of this created a political victory. But it also came with its own complications. By welcoming Russian military presence into Burkina Faso, Traore was replacing one form of external influence with another. He wasn't creating perfect independence. He was creating an alternative alignment. Instead of depending on France, Burkina Faso was now developing a dependency relationship with Russia. Different master, similar structure. But here's the crucial distinction. Traore seems acutely aware of this. He wasn't under any illusion that Russia represented the path to total African independence. What he recognized was that Africa's independence in this current geopolitical moment requires leverage. It requires the ability to say no to any single external power because there are alternatives. The presence of Russian support gave him the ability to resist French pressure, but it also gave him bargaining power, the ability to extract better terms, to maintain more autonomy, to negotiate from a position of something closer to equality. This is the game that previous African leaders couldn't play because the options weren't available. When France was the only game in town, you either complied or you collapsed. Now, with Russia and China entering the competition for African influence, individual African leaders have the ability to play powers off each other. That doesn't mean perfect independence, but it means something far more valuable: real choice. And Traore was wielding that choice like someone who had studied geopolitical history and learned from every previous failure of African resistance to external domination. What makes this moment truly significant is that it's not isolated. It's part of a larger pattern that's reshaping the entire continent. Across Africa right now, you're seeing the emergence of military governments and younger leaders who are rejecting the post-colonial consensus that accepted Western dominance as inevitable. Mali, Guinea, Senegal, Gabon. Some of these transitions have been violent, some relatively peaceful. But the underlying pattern is consistent. African nations are tired of playing by the rules that kept them subordinate. France has responded with increasing desperation. Military interventions, sanctions, support for opposition groups, attempts to delegitimize new leaders as undemocratic or incompetent. But each of these responses has only accelerated the process they're trying to prevent. By pushing Chad to attack Burkina Faso, By making the pressure visible, France actually demonstrated exactly why African nations needed to reject the old system. Traore understood this. When he called Chad's president, he wasn't just trying to stop a military operation. He was making an argument about the future of African politics itself. He was saying, we don't have to live like this anymore. We don't have to accept that external powers get to determine our destiny. The failure of the Chad operation essentially proved his point. And every African leader watching this drama unfold was receiving the same message. Sovereignty is possible if you're willing to accept the consequences and do the work to secure it. What's happening in the Sahel is ultimately a conflict between two completely different models of African governance. The old model, the one France built and maintained for generations, assumed that African nations would remain fundamentally subordinate. They would have governments, yes. They would have militaries, yes. But ultimate decisions about what mattered, resources, geopolitical alignment, military strategy, these would be made by external powers. France didn't need to directly control African governments because the system itself was built on the assumption of European decision-making authority. The new model that Traore and a growing number of African leaders are advocating for is genuinely different. It accepts that Africa will be influenced by external powers. That's inescapable in a globalized world. But it rejects the assumption that this influence should be unidirectional and unquestioned. It insists that African leaders have the right to make real choices about which external powers they align with, and on what terms. These are fundamentally incompatible systems. One assumes African subordination. The other assumes African agency. You can't split the difference between them. France is still trying to maintain the old system, but every year it becomes more obvious that the material conditions that allowed that system to function have changed. The world has moved on. China and Russia have entered the competition. African populations are increasingly connected and aware. Younger leaders are rising who didn't grow up during the Cold War, who don't have the same reverence for Western institutions, who see external alignment as a tactical choice rather than an ideological inevitability. Traore represents this new generation. He's not anti-Western in some reflexive way, but he's genuinely indifferent to Western demands. He's willing to work with the West if it serves Burkina Faso's interests, but he's equally willing to work with Russia or China or anyone else who can provide what his country needs. The personal dimension, 2230. What's particularly striking about Traore as a leader is how intentionally strategic he appears to be in every decision. This isn't a leader stumbling through his first months in power, making reactive choices and hoping things work out. When he anticipated the Chad operation, he didn't just randomly get lucky. He was running an intelligence apparatus that was actively monitoring threats. When he chose to prepare quiet defenses rather than escalate publicly, he was making a calculated choice about how to respond to pressure. When he called Chad's president directly instead of making public statements or appealing to international bodies, he was demonstrating an understanding of how power actually works. That direct communication between leaders, stripped of all the diplomatic protocol and institutional mediation, is sometimes the most effective form of persuasion. These are the choices of someone who is genuinely thinking several moves ahead, who understands geopolitical dynamics, not from books or academic study, but from actually living in one of the world's most complex regions, who recognizes that the old playbook of how African leaders were supposed to behave, deferential to external powers, reliant on international institutions, acting within carefully prescribed boundaries, is not just undesirable, but actually optional. Traore seems to understand something crucial that many previous African leaders missed. You don't defeat Western dominance by directly challenging it. You defeat it by making yourself strategically valuable, by becoming the kind of leader that multiple external powers want to work with, rather than the kind of leader that one external power controls. By showing that you have options, that you're not desperate, that you're willing to walk away from unfavorable arrangements. This is exactly what he did with Chad. He didn't respond to military pressure with military escalation. He responded by demonstrating that he had already prepared defenses, that the operation wouldn't work, and then by showing Chad's leader that there was a better path, that African nations could work together instead of being manipulated against each other. The unresolved tension, 25:00. And yet, even with this remarkable success, Traore faces a genuinely uncertain future. He has successfully resisted French pressure and demonstrated his intelligence and strategic capability. He has welcomed Russian support and shown that alternatives to Western alignment are available and functional. He has confronted a neighboring leader and convinced him to abandon a military operation designed to undermine Burkina Faso. But none of this guarantees long-term success. The Sahel remains one of the world's most volatile regions. Militant groups operate with impunity across national borders. The economic situation remains desperate. Russia's presence, while providing military support, comes with its own complications and potential downsides. Traore is also acutely aware that he's become a symbol for African independence movements. He represents the possibility of actually breaking free from Western dominance. For France and its allies, he represents the existential threat to their entire regional strategy. Both of these positions create immense pressure and risk. The question of whether Traoré's approach can actually produce sustainable independence for Burkina Faso, rather than just swapping one form of external influence for another, remains genuinely unresolved. He's making different choices than previous African leaders, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's found a permanent solution to the fundamental problem of how African nations maintain genuine agency in a world where external powers will always seek to influence them. What he has demonstrated, though, is something revolutionary, that the outcome is not predetermined, that African leaders don't have to accept the constraints that previous generations accepted, that the rules that govern Franco-African relations for over a century can actually be broken. The significance of what happened between Chad, Burkina Faso, and France extends far beyond these three countries. It reveals something about the state of global power dynamics in the early 21st century. For the entire post-World War II era, Western dominance, whether American, French, or British, was essentially assumed. There were debates about how this dominance should be exercised, how harshly it should be enforced, whether it should include any genuine partnerships with subordinate powers. But the dominance itself was rarely questioned. The idea that an African leader could simply refuse to accept Western direction was almost incomprehensible within the institutional and intellectual frameworks that governed international relations. Traoré's success in neutralizing the Chad operation, in confronting French pressure, in shifting Burkina Faso's geopolitical alignment without triggering immediate Western military intervention. This represents a genuine break with that era, not the end of Western influence in Africa that will persist in various forms for the foreseeable future, but the end of the assumption that Western influence is inevitable and unquestionable. Africa is moving toward a genuinely multipolar configuration, multiple powers competing for influence, multiple potential partners available for African leaders, multiple ideological and strategic models available. This creates instability and uncertainty, yes, but it also creates the possibility of something that hasn't existed for generations: actual African choice. Traoré understands this. He's operating according to the logic of this emerging multipolar world. He's not trying to create perfect independence. That's not realistically possible for a poor nation in an interconnected world. He's trying to maximize his country's agency, to expand the range of real choices available to his government, to break the assumption that external powers get to unilaterally determine Burkina Faso's destiny. So as we wrap this up, we're left with a question that extends beyond Burkina Faso or even the Sahel. Is what happened between Chad and Burkina Faso an anomaly? One clever leader managing one successful maneuver in a fundamentally unchanged global power structure? Or is it a harbinger of something larger? A sign that the entire system that has governed international relations for centuries is actually in the process of transforming? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. Traoré's success doesn't mean that Western dominance is finished, France will continue to have military bases and economic leverage and diplomatic influence across Africa. The United States will continue to try to shape African politics to serve its interests. But what has changed is the assumption of inevitability. African leaders now have to persuade, to negotiate, to make their case. They can't just assume compliance. And when they do encounter pressure, there are actually alternative paths available. That's a genuinely different situation than the one that existed even a decade ago. What Traore demonstrated, perhaps more than anything else, is that understanding the game, really understanding how power actually works, how pressure is applied, how influence operates, can sometimes be more valuable than military superiority or economic resources. He saw what was coming. He prepared quietly. He turned the tables diplomatically. He showed both Chad and the rest of Africa that there was another way. Whether that way actually leads to sustainable independence for Burkina Faso, whether other African leaders can replicate his success, whether this represents the beginning of a genuine decolonization of African politics or just one clever maneuver in an essentially unchanged system. These questions remain open. But one thing is certain: the moment when everything seemed settled, when Western dominance seemed natural and permanent and unquestionable, that moment has passed. And in its place, we're seeing the emergence of something genuinely new. African leaders treating geopolitics not as a set of predetermined rules they must accept, but as a competitive arena where they can actually play to win.